that there are many levels in Yetzias Mitzrayim. There's Yetzias Mitzrayim that happened in the physical sense. There's Yetzias Mitzrayim that we mark and we have to experience every single Pesach by night by the Seder, and more so by every single day of Pesach. And then there is what we experience every single day, b'chol yom v'yom, like the Alter Rebbe says, including and especially during the time of Kriyas Shema. And we started explaining this is all, and this also has to, even not only the Yetzias Mitzrayim, but even the Pesach, Matzah, Morim, Menachem Lefanecha are also there in the spiritual sense. Every single time we experience Yetzias Mitzrayim, we relate Yetzias Mitzrayim on a daily basis. We started explaining what's the idea of Yetzias Mitzrayim in the spiritual sense, because Mitzrayim down here below came about from constrictions above, even Mitzarim v'Gvulim, constraints and boundaries in Kedusha, and because of there's constraints and boundaries in Kedusha, from that came about the level of Mitzarim and Gvulim, from starting from the first Tzimtzum Addition. That's how they came about Mitzrayim down here below. Once we understand what the idea of Mitzrayim is and above that allowed for Mitzrayim down here below, we'll be able to explain the idea of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So that's where we're holding at again, top of the 5th page of the Maimer, page test. Concerning this, it says, also, the world, it was placed in their heart, meaning everything pertaining even to the highest levels of the spiritual realms even, is dependent upon the heart of a Yid. All matters are dependent on the avodah of every single Yid. This means through the fact that the person's service is beyond measure and boundary. In other words, it's not in a state of tzimtzum. It's the opposite of tzimtzum, constriction, the opposite of Mitzrayim. So then all the measures and the boundaries are nullified. It's in the continuation of this Maimer, the Rebbe is going to use very down-to-earth examples about this going out of one's boundaries, not just like Chassidus a lot of times talks about, he has a love beyond boundaries. It's going to be very practical and down to earth, almost like an expression used in a Fabrengen more than even a Maimer. He says in line 5, the idea behind this is the avoid of every single Yid has to be with their entire heart and with their entire soul, like we say in Krishma. And even more so, with all your ma'od. And Chassidus always speaks about that ma'od means his avoid has to be in such a way beyond his boundaries, beyond his measures, beyond his limitations. Just like when we add the word ma'od, which is very to a different word, that means it's exponentially greater. How does he do his avodah without the limitations and boundaries? Usually the Rebbe is not about nullifying things and destroying things, but here when it comes to boundaries, the Rebbe says one needs to destroy the boundaries. Pashtus, and simply put, he serves Hashem beyond the reason and knowledge, without taking considerations or any types of calculations that the world makes on his behalf and tells him, this is what you should be doing, or this is what you shouldn't be doing. What his neighbors wants to force him to do. It doesn't mean necessarily the neighbors are telling him, but the way they're acting, so he says, I can't be different than them. He also doesn't take in consideration the different calculations of his body and his animal soul, what's enjoyable for them and what they're not enjoying. He doesn't even take consideration the calculations of his godly soul, because we're talking about breaking out of constraints of Kedusha even. Ella, rather, when he knows that there's something that has to do with the love of Hashem, like the pasuk before B'chol Meidecha begins, you shall love Hashem your God. He does everything for Hashem without any measure and boundaries. By the way, in a simple sense, this is also understood. There are certain things you're going to say that maybe a spouse will do for their spouse, or a parent will do for their child, or a child will do for their parent. Certain things are, it's like written, it's recorded, it's obvious, it's a measured thing. But if a person really loves the other person, so then despite the fact that it says all you have to do for them, all you should do for them, or all you will do for them is such and such, he says, what do you mean? I love them to death. I love them to death. I love them to the greatest degree. I'll do anything for them beyond even what it says in the books I have to do for them. So he says, when a person has that type of love and attitude towards Hashem, so then it shines for him the idea that Hashem assists him also in a way that's beyond measure and boundary. In other words, since he's breaking out of his boundaries, so instead of it being Metzarim the Kedusha, instead of being these constrictions of holiness, so then it's going to be beyond constrictions and beyond limitations. And therefore, because he has Hashem's assistance, it's in his capability and his power to break through the double and quadruple darkness, that he can actually, the darkness is so strong, like it's described about Makas Choshech Mמצרים, that you could actually touch the darkness. The darkness was tangible. The Eretz Mitzrayim, he's talking about the darkness of the land of Mitzrayim, that despite that terrible darkness that was in the land of Mitzrayim, that was tangible, still in all, Shagam Sham Yelchol Bnei Yisrael Erben Mashvaisam, that even there in the land of Mitzrayim, for all the Yidden, there was light in their settlements. Despite being in the land of Mitzrayim, in a state and situation where the darkness was tangible, by the Yid that breaks out of his boundaries, Hashem illuminates the darkness in the greatest way. Not only that, he completes his mission to make Hashem a home down here below. He begins by making a home for the Eibishter in his own 4 cubits. In his entire environment, and the entire world. How come? What's my connection with the entire world? I have to take care of myself, my own mishpacha, my own family, my own house, my own neighborhood. So he says, the Chayv Adam Leimer B'Shvil Nivra. A person is obligated to say that for my sake the world was created. How? What way does he change the world? Through his avodah to illuminate with the candle of the mitzvah and the Torah is a light, top of page Yud. He uses it to illuminate his portion, his allotted portion in the world. But it doesn't stop there. When he illuminates his allotted portion in the world, and through that he illuminates the entire world. That also in the rest of the world it should begin shining. That there is an owner to this palace, to this building, like the story with Avraham Avinu, that he was looking around and saying, is there someone in charge of this world? And Hashem revealed himself to him. To such a degree does he illuminate the world that he affects that those above descend down here below. So I should be a home for Hashem down here below. Till the glory of Havaya will become revealed. And all flesh shall see together that the mouth of Hashem spoke. We see the word of Hashem, the Hashem spoken word, the revelation of Hashem, that brings into being and gives life and sustains every matter in the world. Now, this sustenance and that Hashem makes everything in this world is happening now as well, except it's not visible. That the truth is also now like the teaching in the Baal Shem Tov on the pasuk. Always, Hashem, your word is set in the heavens, but the only difference is between now and Mashiach's times is El Sha'achshav Advar Vayu Behelm Vehester. Now the word of Hashem that sustains and makes the world exist is in a state of concealment and covered over. Through the avodah of illuminating the entire world, by breaking through all boundaries and limitations, Hashem's sustaining this world through his Dvar Havaya becomes revealed. So he continues after the brackets on line 11. When Hashem's words that are creating the world is revealed, so then you don't see anymore the measure and the boundary of the world. But rather the mouth of Hashem that spoke and brings into existence the measure and the boundary of the world. And through that, the entire measure and boundary ceases. Since we see the mouth of Hashem, then that's a measure of and boundary of Hashem's measure and boundary. It's a measure and a boundary of the essence. I'll explain that in a moment. It's not a true measure and boundary, like it's explained in many places. Chassidus explains that there's a type of boundary that I am, let's say, constrained by something outside of me. So that's a true boundary. That's a true limitation. I can only do whatever it is. I can only jump so high. I cannot fly unless I take a plane, etc. There's certain boundaries that are imposed on me from outside. It's not something that I choose to limit myself by choice. That's a true limitation on me. How about a boundary that I set upon myself? And I say that, I saw recently a mashal, let's say, you could have Shimshon HaGibor, and he's able to lift up an entire building, but when he lifts up a child, he limits himself so that he doesn't, chas v'shalom, hurt the child. He lifts up with a lot less energy. Is that a limitation on himself? No, it's a choice that he made to limit his energy output. In a similar vein, when Hashem makes Hagbolis, it's called a Medida Atzmis. It's a measure, it's a limitation that he placed upon himself. Therefore, it's not truly limited. So when the Dvar Havaya becomes revealed in the limitation that Hashem placed in the world, so then it's seen how it's truly not any level of limitation. So now he goes on to explaining what we started mentioning earlier, that every day there's Yitzias Mitzrayim. And primarily that Yitzias Mitzrayim is every day by Kriyat Shema. It says in line 19, this is also the explanation. And what it says in Tanya that we mentioned earlier, that when is the daily Yitzias Mitzrayim? That's during Kriyat Shema. What's the connection of Kriyat Shema with Yitzias Mitzrayim? It's not just because we mentioned at the end of Parshas Vayomer about Asher Sicham Eretz Mitzrayim, but the very theme of Kriyat Shema, beginning from Shema Yisrael and continuing V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha b'chol meidecha, is about Yitzias Mitzrayim. Ki inyan de Kriyat Shema hu V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'chol nafsha b'chol meidecha. What's the idea of Kriyat Shema? Loving Hashem with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your ma'od. And we said before, Shezoy avoida ba'efen sheyitziyam and mitzarim v'gvulim. This is an avoida, in a manner of going out of any type of constraints and boundaries. And the truth is, this is on top of another component of Yitzias Mitzrayim, v'zel noisav l'kach sheba'amiris havaya echad. This in addition to the fact that when saying havaya echad tzrich aliyas hakavana kipshuta, top of page Yud Aleph, limser nafshel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the literal, simple meaning when a person thinks Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad is that I'm ready to totally join Hashem if necessary. Now, Mesiras Nefesh giving up one's life for Hashem, by the Mesiras Nefesh. You see the idea of self-sacrifice is going out of every measure and boundary. Ois Dalet now, line 3. This is also what it says. This happens to be the Kapitel Tillim that the Rebbe was saying in Tafshin Lamed Daled. At that year, they started saying Kapitel Ayin Gimel for the Rebbe. So he turned 72. So in that Kapitel Tillim it says, Kol she'edi ulevavi, that my body and my heart pours out sur levavi, the might, the stone, the rock of my heart, v'chelki, and my portion Elikim Hashem la'olam, forever. So the Rebbe is going to explain this passage. Shenasa etzloi kilyoin v'tshuka v'tayni lalakus, that the person reaches a stage of his heart pouring out, and a desire and a yearning and a delight for godliness. Umedayik, and the pasuk uses specifically the terms kol she'edi ulevavi, that both my she'edi and levavi have this yearning and outpouring towards Hashem, and like expiring towards Hashem. That the word she'edi goes on the body, and my heart is going on the nefesh. Both his body and his nefesh are by him in a way of pouring out and yearning to Hashem, as stehen an oisgus and an oisgang lavayim. Begam kolam loshen tainug. Kol is also from the word delight. So they're also delighting and enjoying Hashem, not just his nefesh, but also his body. How come? Why is the person in such a state that kol she'edi levavi v'tamadavar? The reason for this is meshetzur levavi v'chelki. Was is sein Herz? Was is die Starkheit von sein Herz? Was ist sein Chelik ba'olam hu Elikim? Zur levavi v'chelki le'olam Elikim le'olam. Meaning that what is my heart about, and what is the might of my heart? That's what means sur levavi. And what is my portion in the world? That's all godliness. That since he realizes and feels all of it is godliness, so therefore his heart and soul pours out to Hashem. So he says in line 14, this idea is by him in a way is beyond change. From the word forever, that is ongoing, unchanging. Like the Tzemach Tzedek writes on his notes in Tehillim and explains this kapitel. How does a person have this type of everlasting outpouring to Hashem, an unchanging outpouring to Hashem? This comes about because the avodah of the yechida of the soul, of the very essence of the soul. It's the avodah that you shall love Hashem with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Then the Yidden are called, they are making up the will of Hashem, like the well-known teaching of the Mezritcher Magid. We've had this before, that the difference, the Chazal say the difference between the first parsha of Krishma and the second parsha of Krishma, that in the second parsha of Krishma it speaks about that the Yidden themselves have to do work. It's talking about Ein Oisen Ritzayin Shel Makim. It says, V'ayim Shmaya Tishmu, it'll be if you listen, and if you don't listen, so we're talking about persons not doing the will of Hashem. The first parsha of Krishma doesn't talk anything about working. Why? Because it's Oisin Ritzayin Shel Makim. It doesn't talk about anything negative. They're doing the will of Hashem. That's the simple meaning of the Gemara. The Mezritcher Magid says that being that the first part of Krishma it mentions in the second parsha of Krishma it doesn't mention B'chol Meidecha. All it says La'avdei B'chol Avavchem B'chol Nafshchem. So when a person serves the Eibishter in a way of B'chol Meidecha, with all his might beyond limitations. So that creates a will by Hashem. It's oisin return shalmakim. In other words, it's a level totally beyond Seder Ishtalshlus, and therefore can make up a completely new will. In the second part of Krishma, it's called Ein Oisin Return Shalmakim. We do not make Hashem's will because we're only doing the avoid in the way of Medida Vagbola. We're only doing B'chol Avavchem, B'chol Nafshchem. We're not doing Ma'oid. We're not going beyond that. So therefore, the page concludes, line 22 in the text. Because when the avoid is in such a manner where we are making Hashem's will because we are doing our avoid in the way of B'chol Meidechom. We see in a revealed way in every matter in the world the spoken word of Hashem that's in it. The mouth of Hashem spoke. Top of page Yud Beis. So earlier in that very same kapitel Tehillim, before saying Kol She'eri Levavi Magdum L'Zabakosov, he proceeds to this in the pasuk. Who is to me in the heavens, and with you I do not desire in the earth. And therefore, the continuation is, since I have that type of attitude, that's why that my body and my soul pours out to you, etc. What's the connection? What's the meaning of here? The idea behind this is like the Tzemach Tzedek brings in Shurish Mitzad Tefillah on the back of the Derech Tesacha, in explaining the idea of the love of with you I do not desire. This was the way it was heard, the expression from our master and teacher Nishmasi Eden. In other words, the Alter Rebbe, when he was in a state of Dveikis Hashem, totally out of this world, that he would say in the following language, the following words. Ich will ze gar nicht. I don't want anything. Ich will nicht dein Gan Eden. I don't want your Gan Eden. Ich will nicht dein Olam Haba Chulu. I don't want your Olam Haba. Ich will mehr nicht als dich allein. All I want is you alone. So the Rebbe analyzes these words of the Alter Rebbe on line 10. According to what it's known that the speech of the Alter Rebbe was very exact in a total manner in every word that he said. This is all when the Alter Rebbe, whenever he spoke, was very exact. How much more so when he was in a state where he's completely out of this world, completely joined with Hashem. For sure, every word that he said was very exact. You have to understand and analyze the exact language that we're very exact when we repeat the story. That the Alter Rebbe said, I don't want your Gan Eden and your Olam Haba. What is the intention in adding the word your, dain? You could have just said, I don't want Gan Eden, I don't want Olam Haba, I just want you, Hashem. What's the emphasis? Your Gan Eden, your Olam Haba. So the Rebbe says in line 16, that explanation, this is Shakavani, he lishloel, afilu ha'inyan de Gan Eden, kvisha nirgish boy, shu Gan Eden, shulcha, dain Gan Eden. Nois of our close in that time, Gan Eden. That the Alter Rebbe was negating, not only am I not interested in the general delight and pleasure and enjoyment of Gan Eden, I also don't want that. I'm not interested in even that aspect of Gan Eden, that in that you sense that it's your Gan Eden, that's Hashem's Gan Eden. Okay, like it's known, the metaphor of Baal Shem Tov on the pasuk, a tefillah for a pauper that he wraps himself up, and before Hashem he pours out his speech and his talk. The nature is when you enter into the royal palace, it's so overwhelming. Because the great delight in seeing all the treasures that are seen in all the chambers before you come into the inner chamber that the king is in. You could totally become swallowed up, and you could lose yourself completely in that. Until you don't approach even the room that the king is in. The king of kings himself. Because even prior to that, there's the outpouring of the soul. That's the tefillah of the poor person when he wraps himself up. The davening of the poor person is that should be prayim, that before Hashem he should pour out his talk. He doesn't need a level of in Shamayim, even not the level the way it's recognizing Gan Eden, that's your Gan Eden. He doesn't even need Olam Haba that's higher than Gan Eden. Even the level of Olam Haba, the way it's recognized that it's your Olam Haba. Also your Gan Eden and your Olam Haba. They're only Gan Eden or Olam Haba. They're not of Hashem's very essence. But the person's will is, I only want you alone. He says, I only want you, or you alone. Hashem's very essence, the way is in a manner that there's nothing besides him, alain, completely alone. We'll stop over here.